In life, emotions often resemble waves that continually rise in the mind. There are moments when we feel peaceful and light, but there are also times when the mind is swept into worrying, fear, anger, or regret. Many people spend their entire lives trying to control their emotions. Yet the more they try to hold on to or resist them, the more exhausted and trapped they feel. The path to emotional freedom is not a path to escape emotions, but a journey of learning to understand, observe, and let go of the invisible bonds of the mind. In this video of Buddha's wisdom journey, we will explore the profound wisdom of Buddhism on how to free ourselves from negative emotional reactions, allowing the mind to become lighter, calmer, and more free. When we begin to understand the nature of emotions and learn to look at them with mindfulness, we realize that freedom does not lie in changing the outside world, but in the ability to master the inner world within ourselves. This is the first step on the path that leads to true peace. In the modern world, people can connect with each other with just a touch on a screen, access countless pieces of information in a matter of seconds, and build lives that appear almost perfect from the outside. Yet there is a quiet truth that many people are experiencing. The more we live in a world full of convenience and speed, the more the mind can become heavy and unsettled than ever before. Many people wake up in the morning with a vague sense of anxiety. They open their phones and scroll through news, images of other people, stories of success, and lives that seem happier than their own. And then, even without saying it out loud, a feeling of comparison, lack, or invisible pressure begins to arise in their minds. A new day has not truly begun yet, but emotions have already started pulling them in different directions. This is something that many people are going through, not because they are weak, but because the human mind is naturally very easily drawn into the flow of emotions. Just a small comment can make us think about it all day. Just an old memory can make the heart feel heavy. Just an unclear fear can keep us awake through the night. Emotions, in some way, are like the weather of the soul. Some days are sunny, some days are rainy, some days the sky is clear, but there are also days when dark clouds suddenly gather. And the most difficult thing is not that emotions appear, but how we respond to them. Many people believe that in order to be happy, they must eliminate negative emotions. They try to be stronger, try to be more positive, try not to think about the things that cause them pain. But the more they try to push emotions away, the more they realize that those emotions are still there, quietly existing inside. The truth is that emotions are not the enemy. They are simply signals. They appear, change, and disappear, just like clouds drifting across the sky. But the problem begins when we think that we are those clouds. When we identify ourselves with anger, with sadness, with fear, we begin to feel trapped in our own inner world. A person may live in a beautiful house, have a stable job, and have family and friends. But if the mind is constantly being pulled around by emotions that are not clearly understood, they may still feel that something very important is missing. Inner freedom. Emotional freedom does not mean that you will never feel sad, never feel angry, or never feel worried. That is almost impossible for a human being. Emotional freedom is the ability to experience emotions without being controlled by them. It is the ability to see anger arising without becoming that anger. It is the ability to recognize sadness without letting that sadness define your entire identity. When this begins to happen, a very subtle but profound shift appears in life. Things that once easily made you lose your calm will no longer feel as powerful as before. The words of others will no longer hurt you as easily as they once did. And negative thoughts will no longer occupy your mind for the entire day. This is not coldness or indifference. On the contrary, it is a very alive and mindful state of mind. You still feel everything, but you are no longer swept away by it. In the wisdom of Buddhism, this is seen as an important step on the path of inner liberation. Not liberation from the world, but liberation from the unconscious reactions of the mind itself. When a person begins to observe emotions, instead of reacting immediately, they start to see a very important truth. Emotions are only temporary states, not the true nature of a human being. They come and go. But if we do not recognize this, we may spend our entire lives chasing after them. When we are happy, we cling tightly to happiness. When we are sad, we try to escape from sadness. When we feel fear, we try every possible way to control the future, and that very cycle keeps the mind from ever truly resting. But there is another path, a path that is not based on controlling emotions, but on deeply understanding them, a path that does not require you to become a perfect person, but simply asks you to begin looking into your inner world with mindfulness and patience. When you begin to walk this path, you will gradually realize that emotional freedom is not something distant or mysterious. It begins with very small moments. The moment you pause before reacting, the moment you observe anger instead of speaking words you might later regret, the moment you realize that the thoughts in your mind are not always the truth. Each small moment like this, when accumulated over time, will gradually change the way you experience life. And one day, you may realize that the things that once caused you the greatest suffering now feel like gentle ripples on the surface of a lake. The path of emotional liberation is not a path of escaping life. It is the path of learning how to live in this life with a lighter mind, a more open heart, and greater freedom. And from that inner freedom, a very deep kind of peace begins to appear. A kind of peace that does not depend on circumstances, does not depend on other people, but comes from a clear understanding of your own mind. That is where this journey begins. When people begin to observe their inner world with sincerity, they gradually realize that most of the suffering in life does not come directly from external circumstances, but from the way the mind reacts to what is happening. Two people can go through the same event, yet the emotions and pain they experience can be completely different. This shows that the root of emotional freedom does not lie in changing the world, but in understanding the mechanism of one's own mind. The human mind has a very strong habit reacting immediately. When hearing a criticism, anger appears. When losing something, sadness arises. When thinking about the future, worrying begins to form. These reactions happen so quickly that we often do not realize that between the event and our reaction, there is always a very small space. That space is where emotional freedom begins. If people do not recognize this space, they will live their whole lives like a leaf being carried by the wind. Emotions appear and they are pulled along. Thoughts arise and they believe they are the absolute truth. A single word from someone else can determine their mood for the entire day. An old memory can make them sink into sadness for hours, but when awareness begins to appear, something very interesting happens. People start to see emotions like a phenomenon that is taking place, rather than something they must identify with. For example, when anger arises, instead of reacting immediately, a mindful person can recognize this is anger. Just such a simple recognition creates a distance between the observer and the emotion, and within that distance, the anger begins to lose part of its power. This does not mean the emotion disappears immediately, but when you see it clearly, you are no longer completely controlled by it in an unconscious way. That is why in many meditation traditions, people often say that awareness is the first step toward liberation. When the light of awareness shines into the mind, automatic reactions begin to slow down. Emotional habits that once seemed very powerful begin to become easier to understand. One of the most important things people need to understand about emotions is this: emotions always change. No emotion lasts forever, but because we often cling to them or resist them, they seem to last longer. When we are sad, we constantly think about the things that make us sad. When we are angry, the mind repeats the story of the person who hurt us again and again. That cycle of thought feeds the emotion and allows it to continue existing. When awareness appears, this cycle begins to break. Instead of continuously feeding emotions with thoughts, people learn to simply observe them. A feeling of sadness appears. They recognize it. They feel it in the body, in the breath, in the state of the mind, but they do not add a story to it. They do not continue telling themselves the reasons why they are sad, and something remarkable begins to happen. The emotion gradually dissolves on its own, like a cloud, when the wind is no longer pushing it strongly. When practicing this over a long period of time, people begin to experience a very special kind of freedom. Emotions still appear, but they no longer occupy the entire sky of the mind. They are simply like clouds passing by, while the vast sky of awareness remains there, quiet and spacious. A person who lives with emotional freedom is not someone who never faces difficulties. They still have tired days, moments of sadness, and challenges in life. But the difference is that they are no longer trapped in those states for too long. They understand that everything in the mind has a temporary nature. Joy comes and goes. Sadness comes and goes. Anger comes and goes. When this is deeply understood, people begin to loosen their attachment to emotions. And when attachment decreases, the mind becomes much lighter. An interesting thing is that when people are no longer controlled by negative emotions, they also begin to experience positive emotions more deeply. Joy becomes more natural. Peace appears in very simple moments. While walking, while drinking tea, while sitting quietly in a peaceful afternoon, they no longer need very big things to feel happy, because happiness no longer depends completely on external circumstances. That is when people begin to understand that emotional freedom is not about removing emotions, but about changing their relationship with them. Instead of being swept away by emotions, they learn to stand steady within that flow. Instead of running away from uncomfortable states, they learn to look directly at them with calmness and understanding. Over time, this practice creates a deep maturity in the soul. People become more patient with themselves. They are no longer too harsh about their own mistakes. They understand that everyone carries their own inner struggles. From that understanding, compassion also begins to grow. When you are no longer fighting with your own emotions, you also become gentler with the emotions of others. You no longer react too strongly to the unpleasant behavior of others, because you understand that behind those behaviors there is often fear, hurt, or lack of understanding. And this very understanding opens the door to a deeper kind of freedom. Freedom from the cycle of reaction and conflict. In the end, the path of emotional liberation is not a quick technique. It is a process of the maturation of awareness. Each time you observe an emotion, instead of reacting immediately, you create a small change in your mind. Those small changes, when accumulated over time, gradually become a great transformation. One day, you may realize that your mind has become much more spacious, calmer, and freer than before, and that is the beauty of this journey. Emotional freedom is not a destination in the distant future. It is built moment by moment, right in the way you look at and understand what is happening inside your own mind. Finally, when speaking about the path of emotional liberation, the most important thing to understand is that this is not a destination you can reach after just a few days or a few attempts. It is a very deep journey of inner growth, a journey in which, with each passing day, you understand yourself a little more, become a little gentler, and a little more free. Many of us have become accustomed to living in the rush of emotions. When we feel happy, we want to hold on to that happiness forever. When we feel sad, we try every way possible to escape from sadness. When we feel angry, we react immediately, and only afterward do we feel regret. We often think that this is simply natural for human beings, and indeed, emotions are a very natural part of life. But what many people do not realize is this: we do not necessarily have to become slaves to our emotions. There is a very big difference between feeling emotions and being controlled by them. A person can feel sadness and still maintain clarity. A person can experience anger without letting it destroy important relationships. A person can face fear without allowing fear to determine their entire life. That is the true nature of emotional freedom. Freedom does not mean removing emotions from life. In fact, when people begin to truly understand their emotions, they become more sensitive and more alive to life. They feel more deeply the beauty of a quiet morning. They appreciate more the simple moments with family and friends, and they also understand more clearly the pain of others, because when you have looked deeply into your own inner world, you begin to realize that every human being carries their own stories, their own fears, and their own wounds. From that understanding, compassion begins to grow naturally. A person with emotional freedom is not someone who is always strong. They also have days of weakness, moments of exhaustion, and times when they feel lost. But the difference is that they no longer fight against those states. They learn to accept that emotions are like the seasons of the year. There are seasons of warm sunshine. There are seasons of rain. There are seasons of cold winds. But no season lasts forever. When this is understood, the mind begins to relax. People no longer try to control everything. They are no longer obsessed with the need to always feel happy. Instead, they learn to live fully with each moment, no matter what emotion that moment brings. And within that acceptance, a very deep kind of peace begins to appear. It is not a peace that depends on favorable circumstances. It is not a temporary joy that comes from external things. It is a quiet state from within, like a deep and still lake. On the surface, there may still be ripples, but in the deeper layers, the water remains completely calm. When people begin to live from that deeper layer of the mind, life becomes much lighter. The things that once caused them stress no longer seem so important. Negative thoughts no longer occupy the entire mind, and the difficulties in life no longer make them feel completely lost. They begin to look at life with a more open perspective. They understand that every experience, whether pleasant or difficult, can become a part of growth. The path of emotional liberation, therefore, is not a path of escaping life. It is the path of learning how to live in this world with a steadier heart and a clearer mind. Every time you pause to observe your emotions,